By the year 468, the Western Roman Empire was a shell wearing the armor of its ancestors. Gaul was fractured among Visigothic and Frankish warlords. Hispania answered to Suevi kings in all but name, and Britannia had been quietly abandoned for 2 generations. What remained of the West's tax base, its shipping lanes, and above all its grain, sat in North Africa, under the boot of Gaiseric and his Vandal kingdom, ever since Carthage fell to him in 439. Rome without Africa was a capital that could not feed itself, and everyone in the corridors of Ravenna and Constantinople knew it. So in that year, the 2 halves of the empire did something they had not done in decades. They cooperated. Emperor Leo I in the east poured an almost unthinkable fortune, more than 100,000 pounds of gold by later Byzantine accounting, into a single joint expedition. Over 1,000 ships and some 10,000 men, under the general Basiliscus, sailed for Africa with one purpose: to break the Vandal kingdom and hand its farmland back to Rome. It nearly worked. Basiliscus landed his forces at Cape Bon, a strike of days from Carthage itself, and Gaiseric, cornered, asked for a truce to buy time. Basiliscus granted it. That single pause, 5 days by most ancient accounts, is the hinge our timeline turned on. Gaiseric used the truce to load his lightest, fastest ships with pitch and dry timber, and when the wind finally turned on shore, he sent them burning into the anchored Roman fleet. In our history, the fire caught, the fleet burned, and the West's last chance to feed itself died in the water off the African coast. But wind is not law. In the file that follows, we trace what happens when that same night the wind holds 2 hours longer before it turns. Basiliscus's outer picket ships spot the fire ships early, and the Roman fleet has time to cut anchor and scatter before the flames ever reach the main line. With the fire ships blunted and scattered before they strike, Basiliscus presses the advantage he was never allowed in our timeline. Carthage falls within the season. Gaiseric is contained to a rump territory in the western Maghreb, and the African grain fleet sail for Rome and Ravenna again for the first time in nearly 30 years. The immediate effect is fiscal, not dramatic. A functioning tax base means the Western treasury can pay its own soldiers instead of renting barbarian federates on borrowed credit, the single mechanical failure that had been hollowing out the West for a century. Emperor Anthemius, freed from the fiscal death spiral that historically doomed him within a year of the disaster, is able to outlast and finally sideline his rival kingmaker Ricimer, ending the revolving door of puppet emperors that defined the West's final decade in our own history. Over the following 2 generations, a stabilized Western court does what stabilized Roman courts had always done. It centralizes. Legal codification accelerates a generation early. Professional bureaucracy re-expands to fill administrative gaps left by the collapse of Gaul and Hispania, and the Rome-Ravenna-Constantinople axis functions again as one interconnected system rather than 2 increasingly foreign halves of a broken whole. This is not a fantasy of unbroken glory. The West still faces real pressure from Frankish and Gothic power blocks, and the eventual settlement looks less like reconquest than federation. Roman law and coinage extended as the administrative backbone over semi-autonomous Gothic and Frankish territories who find it more profitable to tax through Rome than to burn it. By the 7th century, a continuously functioning Mediterranean trade network, never severed the way it was in our timeline, keeps Egyptian and Levantine grain, Chinese silk routes, and Roman African oil, timber, and metal in constant circulation. Roads and aqueducts, left to crumble in our history for want of an empire to maintain them, remain state infrastructure. Literacy among the administrative class never contracts the way it did in our own post-Roman Dark Ages, because the schools that trained tax assessors and notaries never closed. None of this is a leap into fantasy technology. Every strand is the same Roman institutional machinery we know from the historical record, simply never starved of the revenue that, in our timeline, died at Cape Bon. Carry that single unbroken thread forward 15 centuries, and the world this file describes has no dark ages in the way our history remembers them. No 500-year gap between the Library of Alexandria and the printing press, because the institutions that make libraries and universities possible were never allowed to fully collapse. Technological and intellectual advancement in this timeline is not faster in some cartoonish sense. It is simply continuous, compounding steadily rather than restarting from a lower baseline the way post-Roman Europe had to after 476. The empire this file traces is not the marble and toga fantasy of popular imagination. By the present day, it would be a federal, multi-ethnic, Mediterranean-anchored power. Its Latin as transformed by 14 centuries of use as English has been since Chaucer. Its citizenship as layered and contested as any modern states. Its Senate a legislature in fact rather than in name. Compare that to the world we actually live in, one where Rome's fall left a 5-century vacuum that had to be rebuilt from fragments, piece by piece, kingdom by kingdom, and you start to see how much of what we call medieval history was not destiny. It was the aftermath of a single failed truce off the coast of Africa. That is the premise this file exists to hold up to the light, not as fantasy, but as a study of how much of the world we know was built on the wreckage of things that almost didn't happen. This has been a file from the Divergence Files. If a 5-day truce and a shift in the wind were the hinge between the world you live in and a Rome that never fell, what does that tell you about how solid the ground under our own timeline really is?